Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is The Takeaway with Alex Newman, where I get a chance to sit down and talk to Alex about his latest article for Freedom Project Media. And that article is all about the whitewashing of socialism in our schools. A couple of months ago, and we'll link to it, I actually was on the College Fix website about some quizzes I gave my students over a number of years. One of the questions I asked those kids was to define socialism. And overwhelmingly, almost 9 out of 10 kids in my university classrooms over a period of about 12 years, they define socialism as fairness. They know nothing about the murderous history of socialism. They know nothing about the murderous regimes, the tyranny, the lack of human and individual rights over 100 plus years. And that's what your article's about today. Tell us a little bit about it, Alex.
Thank you so much, Duke. And, I think you set the stage perfectly here. There's so many young people today, I would argue probably the majority, who really have no idea about the atrocious, the bloody, the insanely horrifying history of socialism and communism over the last 100 years. And I think there's a good reason for that. It's because the schools don't teach it. And again, I think there's a good reason for that. The modern architect of the present-day, education regime that we exist under, John Dewey, was actually a self-described socialist. He wanted to turn America into this vision of socialism. And, he went to go visit Lenin in the Soviet Union and, thought that was all well and good. And, he wanted to use the schools to create this new Soviet man. So if you would have the schools, teaching the children that, we tried that and 100 million people at least ended up dead of starvation, of murder, of torture, of just shocking brutality, well, it wouldn't go over well. And so I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to go up to Washington, D.C. for a seminar put on by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And it was just a great resource for teachers to start teaching about this.
Yeah, what amazes me about this is how, as a governmental form, socialism has more or less been debunked all over the world. And you think about the Chinese. 40 years ago, China was a third world country who recognized that the communist Chinese recognized that in order to get wealthy, they had to adopt capitalistic free markets. So China's in this weird place where they're using socialist control to keep their boot heel on their own people, yet they've become the richest nation in the world on the basis of adopting these evil capitalistic premises. What always shocks me is how the one place that really keeps communism, socialism, Marxist thought alive is the universities and the schools. For a long time, since the 1960s, it's been the universities that have been the primary pushers of socialist doctrine in America. Now with things like Common Core, it's been pulled down to middle schools and the high schools and the elementary schools. And what's alarming to me is why the schools have become these hotbeds and centers. I have a theory as a university professor about why this happens in the schools, but I'd like to hear your thoughts first. Why do you think America's public government schools and universities are so wedded to socialist doctrine?
I think it's a good question. I think it really goes back to the founders of the government education system. I think a lot of them were socialist, communist, utopians. And there's also, I asked Dr. Murray Bassett, who is the director of academic programs at the Victims of Communism Foundation. He kind of ran the whole thing. They brought in teachers from around the country. And one of the things he said was that, we for a long time, going back to, right after World War II, they were very hesitant to criticize the Soviet Union. For one, because it would have made the U.S. government look very bad. We were allied with the mass murderer Stalin. We built his military factories in the Soviet Union. We gave him Lend-Lease material, and he eventually turned that around and started mass murdering people with it. So, that was one of the big things. Well, we can't criticize our ally, Uncle Joe, right? I mean, he can't be that bad, or we wouldn't have been allied with him. We wouldn't have been building military factories. But I think more broadly, the reason that we're in this situation is because the establishment behind the government education system has a view of expanding their control over the American people. And, socialism is a key vehicle, a key ideology that justifies that.
And I think I'll add my 2 cents as a university professor for 25 years. There is no place in American life that's quite like a socialist state more than universities. I mean, you think about it, most of us professors have been in school our entire life. We started kindergarten at 4 and 5 years old. We graduated high school, went to college, went to get a master's degree, went to get our PhDs, went to college campuses to begin to teach. When you think about what goes on a college campus, we get up there and teach 3 or 4 times a week, right? And then somebody else cleans the boards, vacuums the carpets, brings the food in, makes sure the air conditioning's working, trims the hedges, runs the dorms, make sure the heat works fine. In other words, that the structure of a modern university, with the idea of tenure, right? The structure of a lifetime employment after 6 years of work, the idea that on a college campus, professors show up every day, they live in these abstract little bubbles, they teach 4 or 5 times a week, and everybody else is doing everything for them around them. And there's this tremendous disconnect between the hard work and labor that keeps those places running and what professors routinely do. And so consequently, I think there is an inherent tendency to socialist dogma in universities because of the way the incredibly elitist way the system is set up.
That's a really interesting observation, Duke, and I suspect you're probably exactly right. And I think there's probably a big confluence of factors. One of the things that they talked about is that a lot of people don't see socialism and communism as really relevant anymore, especially, the communism of the Soviet Union, for example. Well, the Soviet Union supposedly collapsed in 89 or 91, whichever date you choose. So, how is that relevant anymore? And one of the things that, we heard about is, well, there's actually more people enslaved under socialist and communist tyranny today than when the Soviet Union ostensibly collapsed. And so, I think there's so much more that needs to be explored on this topic. We can look at some of the defectors who said that, there's going to be a fake collapse of the Soviet Union and there's going to be a fake liberalization of Eastern Europe, people like Anatoly Golitsyn from the KGB. And we have the fact that communist China is still today, the most populous nation in the world is still under one-party communist rule. And yeah, they've adopted this, state capitalism where they kind of allow market forces to work under the strict supervision of the Communist Party to gain wealth. And Lenin tried something similar, and the Soviet Union did the new economic plan to try to get capital and technology from the West. But educators need to understand, first of all, this is still incredibly relevant to the modern day. Again, they never went anywhere. They're still a threat. A lot of them burrowed their way into the European Union and the United Nations. They were never punished like the Nazis were after the fall of National Socialist Germany. And we also have all of these developments. People don't even recognize it anymore that, these are the same principles and the same planks that Karl Marx outlined in the Communist Manifesto. So teachers need to be aware of this so that they can teach the students because, as I said in my blog post, if it's true that those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it, and I would submit that, that there's a lot of truth in that statement, we're going to be in really, really big trouble here down the line if current trends continue.
I think we're in really big trouble if we're leaving it to the teachers, because the teachers are being trained to see nothing but socialist dogma. All of the primary ways in humanity, for those who would argue that communism's dead, the wall fell in the 1980s, it's all over, stop talking about it, socialism too. For those who believe that, just look at the primary ways that we read books in humanities courses, whether it's history, philosophy, literature. We now read them through lenses that are 100% Marxist socialist. Modern feminism, people don't realize. Marxist readings. Black Lives Matter theory, white privilege theory, transgender theory, all environmentalist theory, which is sweeping college campuses. All of that has its origins in Marxist socialist philosophy. And our teachers, we're turning out at the university level, teachers who don't even realize that the ways they're being taught to look at history, to look at books, to look at ideas is 100% socialist influence. So to leave it to the teachers, that'd be like saying, let's leave denazification to the old Nazi officers who used to run the court, right? That's not going to do it for us. In the last little segment here, give us a quick thought on your experiences at the Communist Memorial, your experience dealing with in Washington, D.C. What advice do you have for us as Americans, and what did you learn in Washington about how you can fight back about this even in our schools?
Well, thanks, Duke. It was a very valuable program, and I say that as somebody who's studied communism for 10 years. I've been writing on communism for 10 years in journalism, essays, research. And so, I considered myself well-informed on communism, but I still learned a lot. Something really clicked for me there, this idea of communist ideology. We shouldn't consider it an ideology. It's a totally different animal than, say, somebody who believes in free market principles. And in fact, one of the essays we read focused on how communist ideology is really just a fraud that allows people to kind of surrender their own personal responsibility, say, oh, well, we're doing it for the party, we're doing it for the greater good, when they know perfectly well that that's not true. So it was a very valuable course. So, I highly recommend it if educators, might teach this kind of stuff to their children. There was a few things that I would have added into the course, if I were running it, but of course I'm not. But, I think the really important point was, the American people, by and large today, have no understanding of communist ideology, of communist history, of any of these things. And it's so important that we learn these things so that we can recognize threats when they appear, and so that we can understand the value in preserving our system of liberty, which really is just an incredible blessing, and people just take it for granted. So I would say those are the things I learned, and I do encourage people to get more informed on this.
And I agree. I think the answer, the antidote to all of this is exactly what our schools refuse to teach. The American concept of exceptionalism, liberty, independence, small government, empowering the individual, not empowering the state. It's amazing how prescient our founding fathers were. It's not surprising that the American Republican system is precisely what the Soviets most deplored. And it's not surprising either that in our schools, from kindergarten now through college, our kids aren't being taught an accurate version of our founding principles, because those are the principles that stand against socialism. Alex, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take a look at Alex's article online here at Freedom Project. We'll have some neat links thrown in too, that you can branch out a little bit and see how this works. Great topic, important for this day and age, and we'll see you again next week. If you enjoyed this video and all of our videos, please consider a tax-deductible donation so we can keep the whole thing free for you. I'm Dr. Duke. Thanks for watching.